I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to the Essential Geopolitics podcast by RANE. President Trump's plan to implement reciprocal tariffs could undo decades of U.S. trade policy with most of its main trade partners. Alongside China, Mexico, the EU, Canada, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, Vietnam is expected to be one of the Trump administration's primary targets. Here to discuss the implications of potential reciprocal tariffs on Vietnam is RANE's Asia-Pacific analyst, Nate Fischler. Hi, Nate. How's it going?
Hi, Emma. Doing well. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Can you start by giving us a bit of a background on why Vietnam is a likely target of Trump's tariffs and what the consequences would be if these tariffs are implemented?
Yeah, the main reason is the growing, ballooning trade imbalance between the U.S. and Vietnam. So Vietnam currently enjoys a massive trade surplus with the U.S. Totaling, over $120 billion. It has grown by a significant margin since Trump left office in 2020. And it was a concern of the first Trump administration, even at its much smaller size. So the continuing trajectory of Vietnamese exports to the U.S. significantly outweighing the imports of U.S. products into Vietnam is something that the Trump administration will pay, great attention to and look to balance that out a little bit, or a lot, to the extent that they're able to, through coercive means like tariffs, or potentially carrots, some sort of benefits, negotiations. I mean, there are ways to mitigate tariff risks that Vietnam is exploring, but ultimately that trade imbalance is the main driver here. And that has been kickstarted significantly by China +1 strategies, which is also tied to Trump trade policies in his first term. His first, trade war with China drove a lot of manufacturing and businesses broadly into Southeast Asia and specifically Vietnam. So you have a lot of these companies, including Chinese companies that have followed Western companies that have left China or diversified out of China into Vietnam. And this has led to, more exports that may have previously come from China or had, final manufacturing or assembly in China being done now in Vietnam and then shipped over to the U.S. So those numbers reflect a concern in the Trump White House. Not just because of the imbalance on its face, but also due to the worry that Vietnam is being used to circumvent tariffs on Chinese products. You do most of the assembly in China and then ship the last parts to Vietnam for final assembly or what have you, and then it's labeled as made in Vietnam, and this effectively ducks tariffs imposed on Chinese products. So that circumvention, the transshipment worry, makes Vietnam a target. In addition to that trade imbalance, yeah.
Is there any sort of opportunity for a concession or discussion process?
Yeah, there is. We're in the midst of, or they are in the midst of it now. I mean, Vietnam. Pretty early on here in the new presidential administration in the U.S. has taken a proactive approach. They recognize that the risks inherent in Trump's trade policy could affect their export-dependent economy significantly, and therefore they've reached out to the Trump administration on a few things. First of all, they've offered to buy more U.S. products, largely agricultural products, in an effort to import more U.S. goods and offset that balance. They're also reconsidering their internet service provider policy that does not allow foreign companies for Starlink, Elon Musk's SpaceX satellite internet provider service. So they haven't determined that yet, but that's one concession that Hanoi is considering in this context. Just get more U.S. investment, import more U.S. goods, allow more U.S. businesses to conduct business in Vietnam, get around some of those restrictions. And a less likely but also possible vector for this is the procurement of U.S. arms, U.S. weapons. Vietnam has been long interested in U.S. Weapons, but cost has been a prohibitive factor for them. This is a different context wherein Vietnam is hugely dependent on Russian arms, and they want to move away from that. And the U.S. is a logical partner there, but the hardware is too expensive in a lot of cases. So that is less likely than some of the other things I've mentioned here, but it's a possibility as a way to mitigate the risk or offer a concession that will please the Trump White House, and then lower the likelihood or intensity of potential tariffs, or maybe even get a carve out for tariffs applied to other countries, or a flat tariff. So yeah, there are ways. I mean, the outlook for actually accomplishing this, I think, right now is not very strong, because the measures I just mentioned will not do much. Kind of a drop in the ocean when it comes to balancing the trade numbers between the two countries. So it's a start, though. And follow through on it would indicate willingness to do more such initiatives like that. And the more Vietnam imports U.S. goods and makes U.S. investment easy and welcoming, the lower its tariff risks will be. But having said that, I mean, the risk is already very, very high. So it will take a long, concentrated lobbying effort and negotiations and deal making in order to substantially lower the risk. But it's a start.
What would be the economic implications for the broader Southeast Asia region if these tariffs are implemented, and what could they mean for future repercussions in the West?
Yeah, so there are a few Trump tariff proposals. I mean, we mentioned the reciprocal tariffs, so we'll start with that. It would, frankly, hamper the U.S. is Vietnam's largest export market, and that's true, increasingly true for a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, exporting textiles, apparel, electronics, increasingly semiconductors. So the reciprocal tariffs would also apply to value-added tax or VAT in these countries. Which is a controversial thing, because VAT is applied also to domestic products. So the Trump administration is considering this VAT, or value-added tax, which is upwards of 10% in most cases, to be a non-tariff barrier to trade. And so the U.S. policy, as proposed, will reflect value-added taxes in addition to tariffs and what other trade barriers. And the U.S. will then reciprocate those measures as calculated by the administration. So that simply means a lot less exports, because the cost will go up significantly. The idea, of course, is to compel manufacturing and investment within the United States, but in a lot of these sectors, I mean, you're not going to get Vietnamese textile factory relocating to the United States anytime soon. So that driver, that stick rather, to compel investment in the U.S. will not work on every occasion, and there are a lot of sectors where these reciprocal tariffs will apply where it will not work, frankly. Therefore, I mean, these economies, heavily export dependent, will need to diversify the markets in which they ship their goods. They expand their trade partners. They've already been doing that to the extent that they can. It's not an easy thing to replace the U.S. market, and they won't be able to do that, but they'll take little pieces here and there. We do see Southeast Asian countries expanding their diplomatic outreach and trade outreach to regions of the world where those types of relationships have not manifested frequently. For example, the Middle East, ASEAN countries are institutionally getting, ASEAN itself as an institution is getting closer to the GCC, for example. And also we've seen diplomatic missions and visits to Latin American countries, again, potentially diversified trade partners because the risk with U.S. trade is so high. So these measures will definitely intensify the diversification efforts of these countries to find new export markets and find more, mitigating risk by having as many partners and potential export destinations as possible. But that process is a long, slow, and not completely not a complete substitute for the U.S. market. But those are some things that or a thing that they will do regardless of the tariffs. But if tariffs are implemented in full here or partially, that will intensify an already ongoing trend.
To take a bit of a step back, can you talk about how the global geopolitical dynamic might be affected specifically by the proposed U.S. tariffs on Vietnam? I know that there's a lot of tariffs being proposed on different countries, but if we could keep it to Vietnam and explore potential geopolitical fallout from that.
Sure. Well, there are no, as of yet, proposed Vietnam-specific tariffs, but the tariffs that have been proposed will hurt Vietnam more than other countries, or hurt Vietnam's economy more than other countries. So, for example, Vietnam, as well as all of Southeast Asia, really, but Vietnam, Malaysia, Thailand, they're all getting into the semiconductor game. And Singapore too is a long running player in that. So one of the proposed tariffs is 25% on semiconductors and automobiles and pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals doesn't matter as much, but in the Thai context in Indonesia, they manufacture and export automobiles. Therefore, those sectors are going to be hit by this, and then the evolving or developing semiconductor industry throughout the Southeast Asia region, just as it's sort of getting on its feet, will be hit pretty hard. And that's another case where compelling manufacturing to move into the U.S. is probably not feasible, because a lot of this is back end, testing, assembly. Not the high-end semiconductor manufacturing that, say, Taiwan does. I mean, Singapore does a bit of that, but the bigger players there are not in Southeast Asia. And that sort of back-end stuff can be done all over the world, and the high cost of doing it in the U.S. Make it less feasible than, say, the higher-end semiconductor design that. And fabrication that requires a much more qualified workforce, and that is a bit more feasible for the U.S. So anyway, a little bit of a tangent there. But generally speaking, the trade relationship with the U.S. is a key for these countries, or Vietnam in particular. As I've mentioned, in the past recent years, it's become its top export market, and that has led to... or not led to, but they're related points that the relationship between Washington and Hanoi has improved markedly in the last 10 years or so. Therefore, halting the trade relationship, which is sort of Vietnam's meal ticket in a lot of ways, would compel them to seek alternate partnerships. One of the things driving U.S.-Vietnamese partnership is the shared perception that China is a security risk to both of them. But Vietnam also has a massive trade relationship with China that it would then need to rely on more in the absence of the U.S. market, or in diminished access to the U.S. market, which is something they don't want to do. I mean, part of diversifying. Or expanding the trade relationship with the U.S. in the first place was to diversify away from China. So you see a little bit of a cycle here from the Vietnamese perspective, where they're trying to balance between these big powers, have good trade relations with both, and that way they're not overly dependent on either one. So this threatens to basically stop that cooperation in its tracks. I mean, depending on the extent of tariffs, depending on Washington's openness to Vietnamese concession offers that we discussed a little earlier. There's a lot of potential variation here in what that fallout would look like, but it would definitely arrest the momentum toward a stronger partnership, and it would bleed out beyond the trade realm, potentially into the security realm, where the U.S. and Vietnam have also been getting closer. So basically, because their economy is so export dependent, they need a market or several to ship their goods, and that would require exporting more to China in that case, in addition to other places, like I mentioned, those sort of newer markets, and the European Union is another alternative. So basically, the growing synergy basically between the two countries on China could be stopped by trade disputes. Because the main reason for Vietnam getting closer to the U.S. is this trade relationship, and if that is put under threat or no longer is of the same value to Vietnam, then they'll change it up. That final point, I think, on how the trade relationship can affect the security partnerships. I mean, it also applies to Thailand, which is a U.S. treaty ally. That's growing more distant from the U.S. and closer to China in the past decade or so. That's not inevitable. I mean, a diminished trade relationship does not inevitably mean diminished security ties, but it does increase that possibility by sort of alienating the countries from one another and giving them less incentive to have a close relationship in the first place, which potentially plays into China's hands because they can come in and sort of fill the void. But these countries want that U.S. alternative in the first place because they are, despite the trade relationship with China that is very valuable and enriching to these countries, they still worry about Chinese hegemony, potential Chinese hegemony and domination in the region, that overdependence would allow that possibility to flourish. So they want the U.S. trade relationship, they want the alternative for economic and geopolitical reasons, and these trade policies imperil that, which can have sort of cascading and compounding consequences down the road.
Well, thanks again, Nate.
All right, thanks, Emma.
Subscribers can read Nate's recent article on the direction of U.S.-Asia-Pacific relations under Trump in our platform. To sign up, visit ranenetwork.com, where you can learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions. That's RANE network.com. Thanks for listening.